Good afternoon. I'm John Fortier. I direct the Democracy Project here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. We are here with really an all-star panel to discuss something that I think is on many people's minds. Are we ready to run our elections? Our elections are coming up. People have questions about how they vote. People have questions about security. People want to know what's behind the curtain of the voting process. And we have here today a group of people who integrally run that process, watch that process, and make sure it works well. Let me begin by introducing them. We'll have a set of questions here on the panel, and then we will turn to you for questions as well. To my left here is Tom Hicks. He is the chairman of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. He has been a commissioner since 2014, but also previously served on Capitol Hill, working on elections at the House Administration Committee. Matt Masterson, one more down to the left, is the Senior Cybersecurity Advisor for the National Protection and Programs Directorate of the Department of Homeland Security. Do you want to say that again, Matt?
No. That name's changed.
Matt is a key person at DHS, working both on election security, but also working as a liaison with election officials at the state and local level around the country. Matt previously served as Commissioner on the Election Assistance Commission and also in the Ohio Secretary of State's office. Further to the left is Maggie Toulouse-Oliver. She is the Secretary of State of New Mexico. She has also been she's a state election official, but she's also been a local election official, being the chief election officer in Bernalillo County for a number of years. And both Bernalillo County and New Mexico, as well as Colorado, which I'm about to introduce, are doing some very innovative things in elections. And finally, Wayne Williams, Secretary of State of the state of Colorado. Like Maggie, has both elections experience at the state level, but previously also at the local level as the person in charge of elections in El Paso County in Colorado. So I'm going to begin with some questions. I'm going to begin with our secretaries. A lot of things people are asking about, but I think one is on people's minds is security. So you are in charge of elections in New Mexico. You've thought about it at the local level. We have some federal components to it. What would you tell people about security in elections? What does the voter need to know?
So I think what voters need to know is that your election officials take this issue very seriously. And it's an issue that we've been concerned about, frankly, long before we knew that foreign states were interfering in our elections, as Russia did in 2016. Election officials are always concerned about making sure that systems are protected, and they go beyond just the cybersecurity component, although the more that we integrate technology with our elections, the more important that particular component becomes. But basically, 365, 24/7 election officials are thinking about how do we make sure that our systems are safe? How do we protect ballots? How do we protect personal private voter information? How do we make sure that our polling locations are secure and that our equipment can't be tampered with or hacked? So these are all things we've thought about for a long time. And of course, when 2016 happened, when the interference occurred, it really put the cyber component on the forefront for us. And so for the last 2 years, I and my colleague Secretary Williams here and our state election officials from around the country have been working very closely together and building what I think is today a very strong and going to be stronger partnership with our partners here in the federal government. Of course, we've worked with the EAC for a long time, and over the last 2 years, we've developed a strong relationship working with the Department of Homeland Security. And that has really involved regular communication between state, local, and federal officials, and developing protocols in terms of how we communicate, making sure we get the accurate information when we need it, and we're able to take action, and of course bringing to bear the tools and resources that the federal government has. So with that, that's just a small little summary of what I think we're doing to make sure that our elections are secure.
Wayne, can I turn to you on that question as well?
Sure. I think secretaries across this country and lieutenant governors in some places, or boards of elections, states organize it differently, have all been working closely with the local elected officials, have all been working closely with representatives from the federal government, from the Elections Assistance Commission, from Homeland Security, to make sure that we are indeed ready for this election. A number of states, like Colorado, have adopted new programs, new processes. We actually began that program and that process before any of these issues came to light, we adopted new standards, for example, for voter verifiable paper ballots, for a risk limiting audit that we can talk about a little bit later. But we've done a lot of things to try to make it not only so that the election is secure, which is part of the question, but so that the people know the election is secure. Because we want citizens across this country to be able to vote, to know their vote's going to be counted, and to have that confidence, because that's a key part of why we participate. We also want folks to know that the results, whatever they may be, are accurate, and that whoever wins the election actually won the election. And that's true for most of us. If you've been around for a while, you've had at least some elections that didn't turn out the way you wanted them to. So it's not just that the winners believe they won, it's that the losers have to believe that the people who got the most votes did indeed win the election.
So maybe I can turn to Chairman Hicks here. The Election Assistance Commission is overseeing some new federal funding that is going out to states that is broadly there to help states upgrade their security and other functions of the elections. What kinds of things are states doing? We think it's a good thing. There's money going out. It's probably not so much that we think it's the answer to all problems, but it's a start. What kinds of things are states doing in that area?
Well, I want to piggyback on a little bit of what Secretary Williams said about states preparing for the elections. States started preparing for the 2018 election immediately after the 2016 election. And so they look at the infrastructure of that, and so they look at, what are their fundings going to be and things like that. So they look at how are they going to get through the 2018 election cycle. So with all these other priorities, basically streets, schools, fire departments, police departments, elections is always looked at as on the back burner and not something that's truly something that should be fully funded. This year, Congress appropriated $380 million. The EAC was tasked with getting that money out to the states. Each state got at least $3 million, just based on population. And states are using that to fortify their systems and thinking about not only 2018, but also moving towards 2020. So they've hired cybersecurity experts. They're purchasing new voting equipment that has paper trails. But they want to ensure that whatever they purchase in terms of voting equipment, that voting equipment is still accessible for those folks who have disabilities. They've also done things like working with DHS on cybersecurity scans and so forth. But for the most part, that $380 million is going towards the purchase of new voting equipment, cybersecurity upgrades, fortifying their voter registration systems, and then some of those states are actually putting that money away for 2020 because they have up to 5 years to spend that. So, and they're working with us on our website and so forth. We have what the outlay is of what the states are spending that on, but they have up to 5 years to spend that. And you may raise a really good point of states, and wherever I've traveled to, have said that this is a great down payment on this. I don't know if Congress is going to decide to give some sort of dedicated funding stream or work with the president on that, but that's something for them to decide. The EAC is here to give advice on how to spend that money and best advice on where it should be put for those states. Even though states run the elections themselves, they still can come to us for advice on what other states do to make their systems even better. And the other point that I always make is that we are in 2018, and those children who were born during 2000 are now eligible to vote. They're not going to have any memory of what happened during Bush v. Gore, but they are affected by that. So we want to ensure that we don't repeat those things. So there are going to be issues that happen, but it's more of the EAC is here to help with the solutions to make sure that confidence remains high with the public, and that if you're eligible to vote, you can cast your vote and have that vote counted accurately.
So these were the butterfly ballot babies. Is
Yes.
that what you're saying? Okay, all right. Matt Masterson, a couple of things I want to ask you. DHS's role, the Department of Homeland Security, it's at the federal level, but before we get to the work that you're doing with states and with localities, can we just back up a little bit and talk about our last election? There's a lot of talk around about what happened. There were certainly attempts to mess with our election, but what do we know that happened? What kinds of things should we put on the table as facts, real hard facts about types of things that happen, and also maybe quashing a little bit some of the excesses of the myths that are out there that did happen. What were the key things that happened, and what are some of the key threats that we're looking at?
Sure. Appreciate it, and thank you for having this and allowing the Department of Homeland Security to participate. Looking back at 2016, I was at the EAC right at the time, and so it's sort of surreal for me now at DHS and looking back on 2016. But what we know, and I'd encourage, this is public record, right? There's the intelligence assessment from 2017. There's the subsequent indictments from the special counsel's office that really lay out facts around the information. And so I'd really encourage Americans if they have questions or want to understand 2016, there's real information out there to be looked at. As we look at the landscape, what we understand is, one is that there was a very real and concentrated effort to undermine confidence in our democracy, to really target our democracy and our democratic institutions as a whole in 2016 through two main efforts. One was pervasive use of disinformation and social media in order to sow discord and distrust in our institutions. And then two was a corresponding cyber effort, right? Whether that's the hack and leak of the DNC, which is a cyber target and effort from the Russians, but then also the targeting of state election systems. And what we know now, as we've kind of worked through and gotten the information, is that all 50 states were in some way at least looked at or targeted with varying degrees, right? Some it was simple Google searches, looking to understand how is the state structured, was the Secretary of State website. Others, we know that there was at least scanning of the websites, looking for vulnerabilities, and in a very small number of cases, an actual incident, right, where access was gained. The lesson learned from all of this, I think, and the takeaway from the Department of Homeland Security, working with all the state and local election officials, is a recognition that our elections are critical to our nation, that they're a target because of that criticality to our function, and that it's incumbent on all of us, the state and local officials that run elections, working together with the federal partners across this country to identify the risks and threats, to understand our cyber posture and how to build resilience in the process. It's not just about securing it, right? But it's that ability to detect and recover from incidents if they occur. And so identifying what are those areas of risk, how can we mitigate those areas of risk and build a resilient elections process. And so that's what, since 2016, our efforts at DHS have really been focused in supporting these folks up here that run elections, that understand how they work, to build a resilient election process.
What I didn't hear you say is that votes were changed or voting systems. So you want to maybe, you talked a little bit about the registration systems that had incidents or attempts to look at them, but maybe talk a little bit more just for the public, what mattered in voting.
I appreciate that. There's no evidence that any votes were changed or that voting systems were targeted. What we saw is the targeting of election systems, outward-facing websites to then gain access to voter registration data, and in at least one case, exfiltrate that data, right? Take that data. And so it was, understanding the risks and threats. It's that that data was available, and at least in that one case, they were able to take and remove that data. But as we look at the grander landscape and understanding that threat actors evolve, I think we all look at our risks and understand the election officials understand what systems they have, how to manage those systems, what data is attractive or available, and how to protect that. So there is no votes changed or targeting of the voting systems. Certainly we saw voter registration systems targeted as well as general IT systems in that way in 2016.
Great.
And it's probably worthwhile to kind of divide the interference or attempts into three different categories. And so Matt just talked about the fact that no votes were changed. So on the voting tabulation systems, those are not connected to the internet. There's no evidence that any even reach that people were trying to come to each county seat or each local polling place, which is what you'd have to do because they're not connected to the internet. So that's one category, and that's where voter verifiable paper ballots is where the audits like Maggie and I do in our respective states help with that process to assure voters that it's there. The second category, the part that is connected to the internet, are the voter registration systems. That's where we saw the actual attempts to scan the systems to see if they could get in. In one state, there was exfiltration of the data, not changing of it, but just taking it out. and leaving it there, so just getting a copy of it essentially. That's not connected to the internet. That is connected to the internet, but it doesn't change any votes. It's not the voting system. It's not where people vote. The third category, the one that they were most successful in, is something that isn't related to the election systems at all. It's trying to influence people via social media. That is something that secretaries of state and election officials do not control. We do not monitor. Well, we don't control what you tweet. We don't control what you post. We are beginning to monitor. And the reason we monitor that isn't so we restrict what people do. That's not our role. But so that we can respond to it. So if someone posts inaccurate information, whether it's malicious or unintentional, something like mail your ballots back today. Well, if that's election day in Colorado, the worst thing you could do is mail it back because we've got to receive it by election day. And so we need to be aware of that so we can respond. Those are really three different categories, and the way you address the issues are very different in each of those areas.
So maybe I can come back to Matt and the Department of Homeland Security. So I know you weren't there then, but prior to the 2016 election, the Department of Homeland Security made a designation that elections were part of critical infrastructure. One, can you explain to the public what that is? That's a term that you use not just for elections, for other parts of the world. And then two, I think we'd like to get into a little bit about how the relationship is developed between the federal and the state and locals who are really running the elections.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I mean, critical infrastructure, we have 18 sectors or subsectors of critical infrastructure. Technically, elections falls under government facilities subsector, but it's a recognition of the importance of, in this case, elections, but we also have the electrical grid, water supply, IT systems, all part of critical infrastructure. And it's a recognition of the importance of elections and the systems that support elections in maintaining and supporting our democracy in our country, right? And so what it means tangibly is, one, we're able to prioritize support services and information sharing to the state and local officials that own and operate the system. So it allowed us to quickly stand up, working with the election officials, the Information Sharing and Analysis Center, to prioritize things like our cyber hygiene scans, our risk and vulnerability assessments to election officials. Our commitment was anyone that asked for those services prior to this election, we're going to get it done, and we've been able to do that, working with the election officials. And then it allows us across the federal government to prioritize and work with our federal partners to ensure that information and intelligence is being shared down to the state and local level to allow them to protect their systems, right? And so within critical infrastructure, it gives this prioritization within our operation, but also across the federal government, saying, hey, these election officials need these things, this information, this support, these services. It is a priority for us because it is a priority for this nation, and therefore we need to do the following things to support them in operating their system. So it's really critical. As for the history of critical infrastructure and elections, it was as smooth as you could expect. When elections were declared critical infrastructure in January 2017, election officials reacted, I think, with a healthy skepticism. They run elections, right? State and locals are the ones responsible, and they wanted to know, what are you doing in this space? What is your role? How are you going to be involved? And do you recognize our role constitutionally in this? And it was important for DHS, I think, to understand those concerns. I think there were obviously growing pains going in, but our effort really was focused on building trust and helping the election officials understand that we're here in a support role, right? That they maintain and run those elections that is good and appropriate. It allows American citizens to engage directly with those who run elections, and we're here to provide the support that they need. And so over the last year and a half, I mean, I'd encourage you to ask the election officials on the panel.
I will.
But I feel confident saying that the relationship is miles ahead of where it was. We're constantly needing to show our value because in the end, these folks are resource starved in many places, particularly in counties. And so if we can provide that support, those resources to them, we're bringing value and helping them support. If we're just there and not bringing value, they're right to question that role. And so it's incumbent on us at DHS on an ongoing basis to show that value and bring that support to them.
Great.
Can I jump
Yes,
in
please.
For a quick second? In that I think that Matt has said this really well, but I think he is downplaying a little piece of what was a part of, is he was actually chair of the Election Assistance Commission when we were working through the initial piece of critical infrastructure. Myself and Christy McCormick were also at this commission still, but I think Matt, during his leadership as a former election official, was helping with the designation piece of being able to have that communication piece developed there, because I think that when the designation of critical infrastructure first came out, there was this healthy, what are you doing? But I think that during communications, or having an open dialogue, we were able to break down those walls so that states were able to say, well, we'll let you come in and scan our systems. We'll give you information on this. And with that, we were able to form the Government Coordinating Council within 10 months, the Sector-Specific Coordinating Council, which is the private sector piece of that. And we have monthly calls, and it's basically to say, hey, what's going on? What information can we share? Because if we're not talking, we're not going to get anything done. And I think at the end of the day, that's going to be a piece where the American people are going to say, there's inaction in Washington again, which is not the case here. But it's also, if you're not talking, you're not going to get anything done. And so I think with that basic step of actually talking and moving forward, with the EAC and DHS working with the states on this, we've gone light years ahead of where we were in 2016 and 2017. But I think that there's still places that we can go. But I think that to have that voter confidence remain high, we have to start with that first step.
Yeah, just to build, thank you, Tom. You said it better than I did. The proof's in the pudding, right? In the numbers. We have all 50 states working with us at this point. We have over 1,300 local election jurisdictions now engaged with us in some way, using a variety of services that best suits what they need, right? And so the engagement, from talking to folks at DHS, the fact that the sector has formed this quickly and been built and matured in the way that it has is really unprecedented when you look at the speed at which we responded. And I think that's a tribute to how seriously election officials are taking this issue, that they're engaging any avenue they can to receive information and get support. And we're really proud to be working with all 50 states in that way.
So I think Matt and Tom have told a story with an upward arc. And so I want to turn to our Secretary of State, tell us, how a story begins when someone comes in and says, we're from Washington and we're here to help you. It's always a favorite line that you hear. But a little bit about the development of the relationship, but also both at the state level, and then if you both put on your local election hats, which you previously wore, how does information that is being gathered at the Department of Homeland Security expertise, how is that integrated into a day-to-day working of an election official? What kinds of things are they giving you? What kinds of things are useful? Explain to the public just how that information allows locals and states to be more aware and more able to respond to concerns.
Since I've been secretary a little longer, I'll go first, because I've got a little more of the background. So 2016, we have a brief notice, hey, we're thinking about this, and the National Association of Secretaries of State says, we'd like to talk to you about this. And then in January, an announcement takes place that it's happening, January 2017, with no discussion, none of the promised discussion. And so yes, the National Association of Secretaries of State was kind of put off by this because we'd been promised a dialogue, it didn't occur. We adopted a resolution saying this isn't nice, please talk to us. And
Yeah.
it was a little harsher than that, but let's talk about the situation. So in 2017, the designation's been made, and Homeland Security, before Matt's there, is at a conference and is talking to us. And I ask a question. When the word of the Russian attempts to attack voter registration databases comes out, none of us had been told by Homeland Security of these issues. And I asked the question, why not? And the literal answer I got from Homeland Security was, we didn't know who to tell. Now, there are secrets in this world, but who runs elections at each state is not one of those secrets. But that illustrates how little they knew at the time. So that's kind of the bottom, in my view, is there's an attack, they don't tell us about it, they say they don't even know who to tell. We have, the difference between then and now is the difference between night and day. We have an incredibly great working relationship with Homeland Security. They have been there, they have They hired the chair of the EAC to come in.
I thought
and
you were going to say that was the bottom. So
no, that was not the bottom, Matt. But they actually have made a concerted effort to learn what states do. States have made a concerted effort to work with them. We've seen changes take place. Chairman Hicks referenced the over $300 million that was granted just by Congress. Usually the federal government takes months and years to get dollars out. They got those dollars out with an instant so that the states could actually use them for this election. And so we've seen significant changes take place at the federal level where they have been more responsive, more willing to listen to us. You've seen the states come around as well as the feds have actually tried to figure out how elections work. We've been a partner with them, and you've seen Homeland Security play an active role in the National Association of Secretaries of State conferences. We've seen them at local state conferences and providing that support for local governments, for us at the state level. And so we've seen, I think, the realization that this is an important threat to deal with has caused people who in the past had been stymied by bureaucracy to turn things around and instead really tackle this head on.
And I'll just say from my perspective, I think I may be the only Secretary of State or one of a small handful. First of all, I came in literally right after the 2016 election because I was elected in a special election, and I started in December. So the critical infrastructure designation was made about a month after I had taken office. And prior to that, I had been running elections in the largest jurisdiction in New Mexico. And I will tell you for a fact that none of this information was trickling down to my level. So what the Secretary of State's office knew or didn't know, I had absolutely no idea of. And when I came into the Secretary of State's office, I found out that they didn't know anything either. So to echo Secretary Williams, whoever the federal offices were telling in my state, it certainly wasn't the Secretary of State's office. But I actually came in with such a different point of view, and maybe it's because I wasn't Secretary of State in 2016, but the minute I heard about the critical infrastructure designation, I was actually pleased because, of course, our elections should be designated as critical infrastructure. Of course, they should have a heightened priority for tools and resources and assistance from our federal partners, especially when you look at the fact that they were attempted to be tampered with by a foreign government in 2016. We as individual states, we don't have the capability to fight, a foreign state on our own. So of course we need a partnership with the government. But I can tell you, and Secretary Williams is right, my very first National Association of Secretaries of State meeting, I come in February, completely naive to the politics of this issue among my colleagues, and I was shocked that everyone was so upset. And I understand why. Of course now I understand why. There had been a promised dialogue. There wasn't a dialogue. Didn't matter to me because I wasn't around when the dialogue was promised, right? But I will tell you, and I will echo what Secretary Williams said and what everybody has said up here, I have seen that evolve over time, and I will give so much credit to the EAC and to DHS. Them hiring Matt was a masterstroke because here's somebody who already had a relationship and developed trust with election officials from around the country, and they really have been making an effort, meeting with us at the local level, as Secretary Williams said, coming to our meetings, trying to learn what is it that we do here, and it really has, and I understand, and I could be wrong, so if either one of you want to correct me, please do, but we stood up our Government Coordinating Council, of which I'm a founding member. You were a founding member as well. And we stood it up and had our protocols, our communication protocols in place, et cetera, quicker than I think any other Government Coordinating Council for any other of the infrastructure subsectors, which just goes to show you not only the commitment of the Government Coordinating Council members, which are Secretaries of State and county clerks and other election officials, but also of our federal partners to making sure that this relationship is working the way that it really should.
So just super quick, although I love this line of conversation. If we just do this for another 59 minutes, that'd be fine.
I know, Matt.
Why is that important, right? So it's awesome we have a good relationship. It's not just that we're talking. It's important because information is being shared and being shared regularly and often. And what that it does is it allows us to see the bigger picture, right? To understand the threat landscape, to understand what types of support services, information can help these folks protect their systems. And then it helps them receive that information, both very technical information, but also general threat information, in order to defend their systems, right, and to manage risk to their systems. And so, that without question, this may be one of your questions, all right, the biggest change and improvement is the amount of information that is being shared, whether it's through Albert sensors, whether it's through the EIISAC, reporting from states to the NCIC. We're just getting regular information from state and locals, and that is critical to understanding the threat, sharing information, and managing risk to the system. So it's having a very tangible impact on the security of the systems across the country.
Well, it's not just how much is being shared, it's also the speed at which it's being shared. So draw the contrast. 2016, Russians attempt to extract information from voter registration databases in November, October. In the spring, late spring or summer, Homeland Security tells us about it. So 6, 7 months later, now that sharing is happening immediately, instantaneously. It's where we can actually do something about it when we learn the information. So Homeland Security has really worked closely with the secretaries, with local election officials, so that we get the information, not just a lot of it, but get it in a timely manner so we can actually address it.
And maybe if I could get both of you to weigh in on, what's the information look like? I think the average person out there may think, oh, a local election official in a small town here is, oh, there's a particular person in Russia with the threat. But give us a sense of both. I think tools is one thing, tools and services that are maybe available that are really useful, and then, without giving away the specific information, what type of information? Give us a sense of that.
Well, I will tell you one thing, it's a lot.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing, right? I think one of the things that we're working through this cycle is trying to better figure out for both of our parts what kinds of information we need and how do we need it. So for example, one of the things that we've done in my office with our funding, the HAVA funding that was given to us by Congress that's geared toward cybersecurity, is we created a specific position to cybersecurity within our IT department. Part of whose role, in fact, one of the primary roles, is to receive and digest this information, figure out what is relevant and useful to us, figure out what is sort of to be saved for a rainy day if necessary, and then also to figure out how to make that information digestible and actionable for our local county officials who may need that information as well. So I think one of the things that we may continue to work on and refine as we go through this process is, with due respect, I'm getting alerts about hurricanes. Okay, I live in New Mexico. Not that that's not important information, not that I may not have citizens, that are trying to apply for absentee ballots in places that are being exposed to hurricanes, et cetera. But for my ability to manage elections, that may be less relevant, right? And so trying to figure out, and of course there's a color-coded system and ways for us to be able to try to prioritize that information. But I think between the federal and the state level and the local level, how do we prioritize? How do we digest? How do we know what we need to read right now versus what can be saved for a rainy day? Those are some of our challenges moving forward.
So let me talk about some of the services provided. So an Albert sensor that detects malicious activity. Those are things that we have received from Homeland Security and deployed at state and local levels. Working groups, where if there is an issue, you can share that information. Homeland Security twice has had a team of 5 to 10 people in my office, once going through saying, well, if we got through, what could we get into? So testing it. So we've had white hat hackers and penetration tests beforehand, but something more thorough and more focused, Homeland Security provided. Then we had another team come in, assessing, is there anything latent here that might have come through at some point in the past, and actually coming through, and yes, we let them in and then let them get by the initial penetration to see, well, if you did get by, then what could you do? So getting advice from them. That type of information is taking place. Other type of information that might come out, The following 432 IP addresses have been identified as hackers or bad actors, so that we can then input those and block those IP addresses from accessing our system entirely. Some people said, well, why don't you just block everybody from outside the country? Well, if you're a Coloradan and you live abroad, we make it very easy for you to participate and vote. Most states do that. UOCAVA requires a certain amount of that, which is the Uniform Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act, giving you what that great acronym spells. They roll right off the tongue. Almost as good as Matt's title.
Yeah.
But we have a process, and so if you're in a foreign country, you can vote, so you need to be able to access our database so you can do that. At the same time, we need to block IP addresses from a foreign country that are engaged in malicious activity. And so that's the type of very specific information that we might get from Homeland Security, and that we can then take steps in our state and every state to protect our databases from that IP address.
So,
Great
yeah,
point.
please.
One of the things that I've traveled around this country and had the honor of representing the United States in several conferences around the world. And so I've gotten to see Americans who live overseas, and a couple of them have contacted the EAC and me in particular about how they've requested their absentee ballots. So on September 22nd was 45 days before the election, and so that's when ballots were supposed to go out. So a lot of these folks overseas were requesting their ballots, but they were being blocked by states. And so they were looking for solutions on how can they still get their ballots and how can they exercise their right to vote. So we worked with a couple of the states to say, hey, can you set up a help desk? So if this goes back to the person saying, hey, you're trying to contact us from overseas, then they are able to email that help desk and say, hey, I'm overseas, but I would like to get my ballot. And so we've worked with a couple of states, and we hope that other states take advantage of that as well, because that's some of the things. And so those are small things that the EAC works towards in a non-monetary way to provide resources to states and voters to ensure that confidence remains high.
So we're not going to leave the topic of security completely. I think we'll come back to it. We'll talk a little bit about audits and other things that are important at the end of the process. But this panel is really about, are we ready to run our elections? And I will tell you a secret. I have been doing a panel like this at one institution or another since post-Florida in 2000, because we've always had some questions, and I think it is fair to say, while nothing is perfect, we have made great strides in that period of time, or even the last 2 or 4 years. So in many ways, we are more ready than ever to run elections. But I guess I want to talk about some of the bigger developments, and some of them are in the states. What's different in voting? What's new? One thing I will point to is in the 2000 election. After that, we realized we need states to have statewide computerized registration databases. That sounds like an obvious thing. We all have them now, but there were only 7 states at the time who had them. That's made a big change, a lot of change in that regard. And then also, I think the change in the way we vote, how much more we vote by mail, how much more we vote early, how much more we vote in flexible ways, and a number of these states are doing that. So maybe I can get you all to talk a little bit about that. Tom, just on the voter registration modernization, we've done a lot to change the way in which we record who's registered, and then the ability of people to register. Do you want to say something about some of the developments that you see from your perch at the EAC?
So from being at the EAC, we see that there's a number of different ways that states go towards registration. We have a small piece in the National Voter Registration Act to help with that as well. But I see that a lot of states have moved towards more flexibility, basically allowing for automatic voter registration, or the 39 states that have online voter registration. So that allows for these folks to register to vote, but that also gives that piece of vulnerability, because that is web-facing, is what the secretaries were talking about. So ensuring that we have security, but also allow for access is imperative. There's 3 types of access that I believe should always happen. Access for our military and overseas folks to have access to the polls, access to those folks who English is not their first language, and access for those folks who have disabilities. So as we go towards registration, ensure that the access remains there for those folks as well. So with that, we want to ensure that as we move forward with poll books and poll pads, that we also have backups to that. So the EAC issues guidance on that, and then just moving forward to ensure that registration is just the first step, and that we want to ensure that if you register, then it's your choice to actually vote. But voters have a piece of that as well, to ensure that they are registered to vote and that their registration is up to date. Because I believe it's, and I might have the numbers wrong, but up to 1/3 of the electorate moves every 4 to 5 years. So ensuring that your registration is constantly up to date. Make sure that you have the correct forms of identification if you need that when you go to the polls. And this is the biggest piece I always say is the foreign actors were looking to put confusion in our elections, not by manipulating votes, but by manipulating voters. So know what the source is of which you're getting that information from. The two secretaries of state that are up here both have websites that will tell you dates of when the elections are and requirements that you're needed. Go directly to the source. Come to the EAC's website, come to NASA's website, and we can direct you there. If you go towards it's basically getting that notice from, someone that you don't know and you believing that. So you want to make sure that your sources are correct and that you exercise your right.
And if I can turn to Matt, you can both wear your current hat and maybe put your earlier hat on. These registration databases and the way we can register, they've transformed the way in which voters can interact with the system and also the way we vote. We use these systems for many more things. We have live connections for people to show up at they have options of where they can vote, and perhaps in some states they can register on the spot and have their registration bounce back against that database. They're doing all these much more complicated things than they were just a short time ago, and yet with that advance, there are the concerns about security. That was the one place I think that really we are going to be concerned with and want to make sure we protect. So tell us a little bit about the benefits and a little bit more about how we're going to protect those systems and what's important.
Yeah, and the secretaries, certainly both of the two up here today, constantly go through a risk analysis, right? What are the risks? Because one of the risks that you can have in voting is lack of access, lack of opportunity, right? That is a security risk in itself, right? If you don't have the ability to participate in the process for whatever reason, then that's an insecurity in the process. So understanding risks, each one of these folks working with their IT staff and their county officials look to manage risks. What are we bringing? What risks are we introducing through this technology? What redundancies, backups, resilience can we build in order to justify those risks, to manage those risks, in order to allow our voters to participate, right? And so whether it's a decision around the use of e-poll books, the use of same-day registration, online registration, it's a decision for the states as they look at what are the risks, how can we manage them in order to empower our voters, but also manage whatever concerns either technically or otherwise that we might have. And so as we've had conversations with secretaries of state and county election officials, they're constantly going through that risk evaluation process. And that, by the way, that's not new for election officials. That's not new since 2016. As they've looked at innovations and improvements, part of what they've had to ask themselves and challenge themselves are, what risks am I introducing? And election officials are natural risk managers. They naturally understand that. And so, I view our role at DHS is helping inform some of those technical risks to help them, empower them to make good decisions about what works best for their voters in their state to do that, regardless of what the technology you're introducing. And I think this has been a long time conversation for me. There's this idea that you either have to choose access and accessibility or security, and they are not mutually exclusive. Access and security can work together and do work together, not just in elections, but in a lot of areas. It's just understanding how they work together and how you manage those risks that allow that. And so it's not a choice in elections to say I either want to have accessibility or security. The system has to be accessible and it has to be secure, and it's understanding those risks to be able to do that's incumbent on us.
So I'm happy to have the secretaries weigh in on that specific question about the databases, but I guess I want to make it a little broader for you as well. So both Maggie, you in Bernalillo County and Wayne at the state level in Colorado, I would say those two jurisdictions have made some of the most radical transformations of the way you vote in a relatively short period of time. I do mean that as a compliment. It's a good compliment. Many times we change much more incrementally, but the opportunities to vote in multiple places in multiple ways with using sophisticated technology, which might have some challenges to monitor. Tell us a little bit about just the big changes that have gone forward in your two jurisdictions, what that means for voters.
Well, and I just want to echo something both Tom and Matt just said, which is that when you're talking about introducing new ways of voting or new technology to the process, and I really do think that the trend in voting has been along with the trend in our society, which is towards more convenience and more choice for the voter, right? I mean, we are on a one-way trajectory where that's concerned, and so when you talk about making changes to the voting process, more and more we're talking about how do we increase accessibility, how do we increase convenience, but at the same time, as was mentioned, also making sure it's secure. No, they're not mutually exclusive, but there's always balancing that has to occur, because to have a 100% secure election process, literally nobody would be able to vote, and vice versa, right? So we always do have to do that balance, and we have to find where that balance is and strike that balance. So I think the biggest change that we made in New Mexico in recent years was in 2011, we passed a bill that moved us from the traditional standalone precinct on election day, where you have to go to your one polling place to cast a ballot, and we created vote centers around the state where anybody can vote at a vote center in their county, and it doesn't matter, it doesn't have to be tied to their home voting precinct where they're registered. And of course, with that, we introduced quite a bit of technology into the process with e-poll books and a need for security in those areas. And yes, it's been a balancing act, because when you go to vote centers where anybody can vote from around the county, we went from having 440 individual polling locations down to 69 countywide. So you are reducing the total number of polling locations, and so your great aunt, who used to be able to walk across the street to the little elementary school and cast her vote, now may have to get a ride a mile or 2 miles down the road to the closest polling place. And so one of the key ways in which we try to mitigate that kind of risk, that accessibility risk that Matt was talking about, is through voter education. The money that we saved in my jurisdiction when I was county clerk by consolidating polling locations but yet allowing everybody to vote at any polling location was to make sure that literally every voter in the county knew about it. And we spent that savings, around $300,000 or so, every election cycle to make sure we were doing ads on TV and on the radio. And I mean, it was kind of just like vote center vomit all over Bernalillo County, all over Albuquerque, New Mexico, right? So you kind of had to really be ignoring things.
Was that your marketing
to
campaign?
Know. It should have been. It should have been, right? And the good news is we actually worked with the University of New Mexico Political Science Department to poll a random sample of voters after the fact to find out, did you like it? Did you hate it? Did you know about it? And 96% of the voters said that, yeah, they had seen something, they had heard something, they had read an ad in the paper or seen it on TV. So that's one of the ways we can, as we are moving to these new ways of doing things, and of course Colorado has taken it even an order of magnitude greater than we have so far in New Mexico, but making sure that the voters know about it is absolutely key and crucial in mitigating that risk.
So let me talk a little bit about what Colorado's done. You really asked about two different areas, so I'm going to address them severally. One of them is in the voter registration side. We were one of the early adopters of online voter registration. We have had over 2 million transactions that are online voter registration. Some of those are address changes, some of those are new registrants. In that process, it is important to have some safety precautions. So our system interacts with the state-issued driver's license, the state-issued IDs. So there's some tie back to an actual person that we know really exists there. So it's not a bot just doing it. It's also not something that automatically goes through. Every single transaction before it becomes part of our database is approved by a real person in a county clerk's office. That person, in order to access it, doesn't just have a password. They use two-factor authentication, so you've got a rotating other series of things to help ensure the security of that online voter registration database. We've made it easier to access than before. You can now text CO to vote, 28683. That will take you into that online voter registration system. So if typing govotecolorado.com is too hard, 7 characters will get you into that system. Establish an award. A number of states have done this for high schools. They get a large percentage, in our case 85% of the graduating class to register to vote. We've established specific processes for individuals coming off parole and out of our prison system, so they're now eligible to re-register to vote. So we've done a number of things to try to make it easy to register. Probably the most significant of those is something I implemented originally through regulation. I needed legislative approval for the last fix. We got that unanimously. So Colorado now automatically registers individuals through driver's license. You get your driver's license, you get your free state issued ID, then you're automatically going to be given that opportunity to register to vote, not with being handed a paper form, but being told, hey, we're going to take this information you've already input, and we're going to automatically register you unless you tell us we can't. And then, so that process is something that we've worked closely with the Department of Revenue in their revision of the driver's license database, so that does it. In its perfected stage, it will check first to say, hey, are you already registered? Okay, they're already registered. We don't need to ask them. They're just going to ask that question to the people who aren't already registered. So that's the system we're going through.
We're actually ahead of you in one way because we're doing that now.
We're working. Department of Revenue's just had some new systems they're adopting.
That's great.
But it is part of that process to make it easy for people to register. Where we are ahead of you, though, is that we are the state with the highest percentage of registered voters in America at 90%. And that's a positive thing. So we then talk about voting. So in Colorado, we, as Maggie said, we're kind of the old Burger King have it your way commercial kind of thing. You want to vote in person? Great, come in and vote in person. You want to get your ballot early? Great, come in and get your ballot early. You can already do that. You want to vote anywhere in your county? Yes, you can do that. We have vote centers. But we're also going to mail a ballot out to every single active registered voter in the entire state. And so those will go out on October 15th. For the military, we sent those ballots out 45 days ahead of time. I established then an encrypted way that you can return it electronically for those who might be serving, for example, on a nuclear submarine underneath the polar ice cap. And so mail service doesn't show up on a regular basis. So we've got lots of different ways for people to vote. Because we send the ballots out and 93 to 99% of our voters choose to vote the mail ballot that's sent them, we want to make it easier for them to return it. So we've established 24/7 drop boxes across the state. I used the last little bit of the HAVA original funds to provide for 24/7 drop boxes across the state. And not only can you drop it in any drop box in your county, you can drop it at any drop box in the entire state, and it will still count as long as you get it there by 7 o'clock on election day. So we make it really easy for people to participate in the process. Now, security is important. So every one of those mail ballots, before it's counted, is verified to ensure the signature on the envelope matches the signature that's on file. And if it doesn't, we'll send you a letter and say, hey, you need to make it good. I sent one of those letters to my own daughter because when she was when she got her driver's license, it was a proud day, and every single letter was in her signature. And by the time she was a college student, it was a scrawl. So Wendy got this letter from me, then she called, I looked at it, commended my election judges for disqualifying it, and then she walked through the process and was able to submit the information so her vote could count. But all of that makes it really easy, and the result of that is that in the last presidential election, Colorado led the nation in voter turnout. We want to make it easy for people to participate, but we're still going to have those security processes. We're still going to check those signatures. We're still going to make sure before changes are made, we have that two-factor authentication. And so, as Secretary Oliver talked about, you got to have all of that process. You're trying to make access easy, but at the same time ensure the security, which some people think is bad, but no, security is what actually makes it so people will vote. Because if I'm confident my vote's going to be counted and counted accurately, I am more likely to vote than if I think it doesn't matter what I do. And frankly, that's the scariest thing going on right now. Is I've seen some recent polls indicating that a significant portion of Americans are concerned as to whether their vote's actually going to get counted and counted accurately. And in Colorado and every other state, every other jurisdiction I'm aware of, we're fighting very hard to make sure that that happens 100% of the time, that your vote is counted and is counted accurately.
So let me turn back to the federal level here, and then I'm going to move down the line on this question. We've heard a lot about audits, or making sure after the election that everything worked well, or at least knowing what happened. And then there obviously is a more specific category called a risk limiting audit, which we can get to. But from the federal perspective, talk a little bit, maybe Tom, from the EAC's perspective, what states are doing. DHS has an interesting role. So talk a little bit about that, and then I want to hear from the secretaries about what they're specifically doing in their states.
I think that's a great question. The EAC is there to provide guidance from voter registration to all the way to election night reporting, all the way to audits. On our website, we have a white paper that talks about risk limiting audits. We have a employee who basically helped Colorado with their risk limiting audits. And so what I would say is that the audits themselves are a way to allow for voter confidence to remain high. And so if you see that the result that was done on election night is audited and that same result comes through, then the confidence will still be there. With a risk limiting audit, you take a smaller sample of that, but you still have the same result of, same they have that accuracy piece to it. This process, we live in a great country where this process is open. And so voters have an opportunity to not only see in some places the audits taking place, but they can also see that from before the election happens, because jurisdictions run logic and accuracy testing. The Secretary talked about, and this is something that it really affects me in terms of voter confidence. And the Secretary Williams talked about how confidence was not always high with some voters, but voters have an opportunity to go and actually see the logic and accuracy testing done so they can have confidence in the machines that they use. Or they can vote absentee in a lot of jurisdictions to send in that piece of paper if they have that piece. The EAC last week held a summit on Capitol Hill with election officials to talk about some of the things that they're doing ahead of the 2018 election cycle and what they're going to do looking towards 2020. So I think that as we move forward, to make sure that voter registration is done for the folks, to ensure that confidence remains high, all the way to the election night results, and then after that to audits, to ensuring that those three pieces come together to say that, hey, even though I lost the race, I have confidence that that's the correct result.
Yeah, one of our focuses and work with the Government Coordinating Council was on prioritizing the use of identifying priorities for the use of the EAC funding that was distributed. One of the key elements of that was improving the effectiveness and efficiency of auditability. Secretary Nielsen's been very outspoken and clear that she wants to see states by 2020 get to auditable systems across the country. And that need for auditability is critical, not just for the integrity of the process, but to really, as Secretary Williams already referenced, give confidence to the voters as they engage the process that their vote was counted as cast, right? And so I'm super optimistic in looking at the auditing landscape, having worked for a decade or more now in elections, that auditing is the area where we can make the greatest improvements most quickly, because jurisdictions, those states even with systems that don't have an auditable record are now moving that way. States like Pennsylvania and Louisiana have already announced and are pushing in that direction. And so now it's not a question of if auditability is important, it's how do we do this best, right? How do we do it in an efficient, effective way that gives voters confidence but is implementable for the state and local officials, right? And so I'm super optimistic that as we look at auditing, it's an area that we can improve on very, very quickly, because auditing is not a new concept now in elections. It's not a new concept in our society. We audit things constantly in our society. And so I think we can get really good at auditing very quickly as we look at how to implement systems that have auditability and how best to give confidence to the voters. So I think that's an area coming out of this election that all of us are going to be working together. And frankly, these two states sitting here, New Mexico and Colorado, have been the leaders on that. I think there's some question on who first did risk limiting audits. We may want to stamp that cockroach out and decide who did it. But that's up to you guys to decide.
Well, I do want to turn to you right now, but first, why don't you give us a definition of a risk limiting audit. The viewers here, I think, have a general sense of what auditing means, but what is a risk limiting audit? And then I want to hear all about what you're doing.
Risk limiting audit does a number of things, but it essentially audits the actual paper ballots. It compares it to, in our case, a cast vote record that the machine interpreted and said, the machine said this ballot counted for Bob and Sarah. And then we compare it to the paper ballot to make sure that that paper ballot actually indeed said Bob and Sarah. It's called a risk limiting audit because you determine a certain number of ballots to review based on how narrow the result is. So if it's a close election, you're going to review a whole lot more ballots than if it's a blowout. And that makes sense. You don't need to spend millions of dollars, hypothetically, to review every single ballot if it's an 80% margin. But if it's a very close election, you're going to have to review more ballots to assure people that those results are accurate. And it gives voters not just an esoteric help, but it's actual statistically based proof that the result actually did occur, that the winner actually won.
That's a perfect definition. And we have been doing audits like that in New Mexico since 2010.
Is that before or after Colorado?
Yeah,
That was before. I'll tell you a little bit about our history and then, allow my colleague. And by the way, I think the competition is healthy, right? We're not trying to outdo each other. We're trying to do the best for the voters of our state. And if we see a colleague in another state doing something really amazing and want to try to replicate that in our state, that's only and always a good thing. So we actually started in 2008 conducting a 2% across the board audit. And what that meant is that after every single election, no matter how many votes were cast, we were always going to sample 2% of the paper ballots and tally those by hand and compare them to election night results. And what we realized shortly after that was that was hugely burdensome. Because it involved cracking into just a ton of ballot boxes and digging through paper. And then we also realized what Secretary Williams just said, which is that is not always necessary. Sometimes 2% is the right number. But most of the time it probably isn't, because depending on the outcome of the election or the wideness or narrowness of the margin, it may be way too much or it may be way too few. And so you need to develop a formula that tells you how many you really need to sample to limit the risk that you are not going to find tampering, right? The idea is that if tampering occurred, you want to be able to find it, but you want to be able to find it in the most efficient way possible. So we actually have one of the key differences between what Colorado does and what New Mexico does is we actually have a formula that's set forth in our statute book, which can make your eyes glaze over. But theoretically, if you have a math textbook or a good tutor or something like that, if you're not a math person, you could look at our formula in the statute and look at the margin of the vote and be able to figure out on your own as a layman, okay, how many precincts are going to get sampled, how many ballots are going to get hand tallied. And the rest goes from there. We, just like Colorado, we hand tally the ballots. We compare those to the election night results. If they are off by a certain percentage, we will hand tally more. If they continue to be off, we go all the way and up to a full hand recount. And that's really, I think, the key for these post-election audit processes, to be able to reassure voters that their votes are going to be counted as cast. Because it's always great, and in every audit we've done in New Mexico, we've never had to go beyond that first round because we've had the initial confidence that, yes, the machines did count these votes correctly on election night. But if anything were to happen, whether it be, the Russians hacking into our machines. I don't know how they would do that because they're not connected to the internet, but if they did, or whether it be simply that the person programming our machines didn't get enough sleep the night before and made errors, right? Whatever the issue could be that could cause those ballots not to be counted accurately, we can count that, we can figure that out in a post-election audit, and we can go all the way and up to a full hand recount if necessary, and that is a reassurance to the voters of our state.
All right, I promise we're going to turn to the audience. We are shortly. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that the EAC is the only federal agency that's devoted to 100% of the administration of elections. And so Secretary Toulouse-Oliver had a great point on what one state is doing, another state might copy and emulate. The EAC gathers a lot of that information, and we serve as a clearinghouse for all these things that are good and functioning, but we also issue guidance on a lot of these other issues. So I think that as we move forward and we want to remain confident of our elections process doing well, so we've developed this white paper to talk about election risk limiting audits. We go out to the states on these issues as well. My biggest fear for 2018 is not the foreign national or foreign governments attacking our elections. It's phishing attacks or something to that degree, or even, something's going to happen because something happens at every election cycle, whether or not that's poll workers getting up too late at 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning when they should have been there at 6. But it's how do we make sure that we fix those problems in real time, or how do we make sure that those problems don't happen moving down the road? And so I think that as long as the EAC is around to give that sort of guidance to the states, we can help to increase the process of voter confidence.
Let me quickly address the differences and what Colorado does differently. So Maggie talks about a certain number of precincts are chosen under New Mexico's audit. Our risk limiting audit takes ballots from across the entire spectrum, from every single precinct. They all go into the database that we use. It's an open source code, and we pull ballots out of, not in gross of everyone in a precinct, but across the entire spectrum. So even if you happen to miss a precinct where someone was bad, we would catch that process in what we do. So there's a significant difference. Now, what New Mexico does is awesome. I think ours is better, but that's because it looks at all of them, and it doesn't compare it to the count you do later or recounting it. It compares it to the specific cast vote record of that particular ballot. So it's a higher level of precision that allows us, and that's because we've got new systems, new processes that we've adopted, new technology that allows us to do that. But that's what the difference is in the two states. Both of them give you a high level of assurance that those votes actually were counted. And for those who want to do more, there's a 27-minute YouTube video that explains the process in great detail.
Great. So again, we're going to turn to your questions while the mics are getting ready, and I'm going to ask you to identify yourself and ask a question. I have one last question quickly on the panel. We're here. There's a hurricane that's been hitting Florida and other states. I'm sure many of your colleagues are working on that very strongly. Things happen that affect elections. Things may happen regarding security or attacks. Things may happen in natural disasters. Talk a little bit about just recovering from problems. All of you have to do it in different states and wildfires, other things in different parts of the country. Talk about recovering from problems that happen, and then we'll turn to our colleagues in the audience.
So 6 years ago, I ran a primary election on June 26th. The Waldo Canyon fire came into my hometown, burned hundreds of homes, forced my evacuation as an election official. So I've experienced firsthand, not a hurricane, because like Colorado and New Mexico, we don't get a whole lot of hurricanes, but we have, most places in the country have things that happen, whether they're wildfires, hurricanes, blizzards, floods, whatever it may be. And so election officials have been working and preparing for those, not just when cybersecurity showed up, but we've been doing that our entire careers, our entire lives, to be prepared for those moments. We worked with other adjoining jurisdictions. We made sure that every single person had the opportunity to vote, because that's a critical part of it. The vote count got suspended when I got evacuated by the police, telling me I had to leave there. But we then came back in and made sure that every single vote was counted. We got in under sheriff's escort to retrieve the ballots that had been under video surveillance in the meantime. And we made sure that every vote was counted. Every single voter had that opportunity. That's why we got a national award from the National Association of Secretaries of State before I was a Secretary of State. But election officials across the state and across the country are ready for this. It's something we prepare for. It's something we had a training to prepare our clerks for. Secretary Duluth Oliver was up for that. It's not something new. The specifics are, and how you deal with it in the specific circumstances. There's legislation in most states for emergencies to allow us to deal with things. Your election officials are ready to respond to whatever that need may be.
Okay, we're going to turn to the audience here. Why don't we go right here? Just need to wait for the mic for 1 second.
Chip Martin, I work with Representative Kepter, and most of what you've talked about has to do with the apparatus for elections and its cybersecurity, but is it Kathleen Hall Jamieson just released a book that one of her conclusions was that social media was really a factor in the 2016 election. And so of the things that you're doing both at the federal and state level, and I haven't seen much at the federal level regarding regulation of social media to help with this problem. What should we be doing in a policy sense?
And can I quickly jump in? This in a way is the second of 2 events we did. So if you were here 10 days ago, we actually had an event on social media in the 2018 election. Some of those issues are also very directly or connected to the election administration world. So if you want to take that on from the election administration perspective, Matt?
Sure, I can touch on it briefly, and then secretaries, I'm sure, have something to add. But DHS is working very closely with our partners at the FBI. They're the federal lead on countering foreign interference and whatnot. One of our key roles has been working with the social media companies who have been really good partners to help inform the state and local officials about activity that they see on their platforms, sharing information around tactics and technical information so that these folks can have the information they need to understand what's happening and not only protect their systems but educate their voters. And so we've had a couple of phone calls with all of the states, with Facebook and Twitter and other social media companies to say, here's what we're seeing on our platforms, here's the actions we've taken. We wanted you, the state and local election officials, to know. Heading into the election, we will continue to engage in that way, make sure these folks have the information. And one of the key points on this is driving, and Commissioner Hicks hit it right on the head, is driving voters to trusted sources of information regarding the election. The Secretary of State websites, the local election websites, instead of relying on Jim on Facebook to tell them, what's on their ballot or whatnot. There are trusted sources that should be used. And so DHS worked with NAS, worked with the state election directors in the EAC and FBI to get information out around who are your trusted sources, where can you go to get the information you need to ensure that you're registered and that you're able to cast your ballot.
I would echo that, and I would just say, as an election official, we were talking about, a hurricane or a wildfire situation or the unlikely, massive, hack that, messes with your voter registration database. That doesn't happen very often. What does happen every single election is that misinformation gets out to the electorate in some way or the other. And so I can say as an election official that we started early voting in New Mexico 2 days ago. My job, principally, between now and Election Day, will be constantly talking to the public about what is accurate, what is correct, assuaging fears. Oh, I got this in the mail. Is this accurate? These kinds of things. So we almost become full-time sort of, communications folks in the days leading up to an election because there's always something. Of course, with the emergence of social media and the reliance on information and social media, that just creates a new level with which we have to engage and be prepared. And it just comes down to responsiveness, accuracy, providing voter education and information from our offices, and having the resources to do that more and better. So put that in your cap for Representative Kafter.
Okay, we can go right here in the front.
Hi, Diane Silber from California. Just 2 short questions. One, on your audits, that assumes that every electronically cast vote has a paper piece attached to it, and I want to know if that's correct. And two, I want to know in terms of voter registration, I read somewhere recently that some Indian tribes have not been allowed to register because they don't have street addresses and they only have post office boxes, and they're not being allowed to vote. Is that true?
We don't have the Secretary of State of North Dakota here, because I know that is a specific North Dakota issue, but you can go ahead.
Let me tell you, generally under Colorado law and most other laws, you need to have a physical place, but it doesn't have to have a street address. It might be, I live under the bridge, I live under the 4th Street Bridge, because I have to know which races to put on your ballot. So I have to know physically where you are, but it does not have to be an actual post office mailing address. And that's true in my state, it's true in...
Do you use you can draw us a map on your voter registration in my state, or put your GPS coordinates.
Yeah.
So there is a way to do that without having to have an address. And I think to do the kind of audits we're talking about, you do need a voter verifiable piece of paper to audit it against. Now, there's other ways that other states who don't have that are doing their best to try to ensure, particularly on the front end with their logic and accuracy tests. But the way to do the kind of audits that we are doing, which I think I'm safe to say we feel are best practices, you do need a voter verifiable paper trail in order to do that.
But it's not required across the country.
That is not a federal mandate.
It is not. About approximately 80% of the votes cast in 2016 had a corresponding paper record to them. And again, Secretary Nielsen's talked about getting that to 100% by 2020, working with the states and locals.
I want to praise you for that question, because this is exactly what I've been saying for the last year and a half. If there's an issue, go to the election officials and ask that question. Don't go just to Facebook or wherever else. It's the election officials who will have that answer for you. So that's a great question.
Okay, go in the back.
Hey, John Ward at Yahoo News. Thanks for the board up here. It's helpful to know everybody's names. And I had one quick question for Tom and one for Wayne. Tom, when you mentioned phishing, I just wanted to clarify, you're talking about targeting campaigns through email and not the ballot box. I just wanted to clarify that. I think that's the way I understood you. Okay.
No, I was thinking more so because election officials, it's not looked at, we see these large counties like LA County, Harris County in Texas, or Cook County in Illinois having a lot more employees, but for the most part of the 8,000 jurisdictions across the country, it's 1 or 2 individuals doing the election. And so they're not just doing that piece, they have to be ADA compliant, they have to be UCAHAVA compliant, they have to know they have to be IT specialists, and we offer training for that at the EAC. But they also have to do things, they basically have 30 or 40 different jobs without additional pay. And so what they might get an email saying, this is my voter registration, add me to the list, but it's actually might not be. So it's more of phishing attacks to individuals in the process itself. So they open up that email, they get attacked, and so what sort of things can be done to prevent those types of phishing attacks?
Interesting. And then Wayne, when you mentioned the DHS inability to know who to tell about the attacks, is that normal? I mean, did that predate the current administration, that lack of information and awareness?
It overlapped. It overlapped because the issue occurred in 2016 under the prior administration, but we weren't notified until 5 or 6 months into 2017. So I will spread the responsibility. I will say that the current Homeland Security Secretary was not in office at the time. Nor was Matt. So since the two of them have been there, we've never had anything like that. And a lot of people know a lot about their lane. But when you go into a new lane, you don't know what's going on. And that's part of what the issue was in the beginning. Those issues have been addressed. We now absolutely, I'm not concerned, because we get notices from Homeland Security on a regular basis. Absolutely, they know who to notify now.
And to be clear, just for clarity on 2016, state officials were notified about the activity the key was it wasn't the state election officials. So state offices were notified, depending in part because that's, whether it was state CISOs or otherwise, that's who were identified as the system owners and operators. Clearly, DHS has a much better understanding now of how the systems work, what the dependencies within various states are. Some states are dependent on the state infrastructure, and that might be appropriate. Other states aren't. So that understanding of the state architecture and infrastructure is everything to us, and I can assure you, as Secretary Williams has said, we know exactly who to contact in the states to talk about, activity, incidents, whatever the case may be, and more importantly, they know how to contact us and reach out to us, and they're doing that, which I think is the most important thing.
Okay, why don't we go over here?
I'm Kumar, and I'm unaffiliated. It's comforting to see how much attention is being placed to assure that the voting process is in fact accurate. Now, in spite of all of that, since the elections are so close, what do you estimate is the error rate in the counting of votes? That's question number one. Question number two is that I've gone canvassing now in Virginia, and the biggest difficulty is among people who have recently moved to the state. So it's not an easy process to do registration.
So,
I would address that fairly quickly. I don't know the exact number, but that's one of the things that the EAC surveys in terms of our report to Congress. This is done every 2 years. So it comes out by June 30th. But it's basically our EVES report, and I equate it to basically a census report for election issues. So basically what kind of machines happen, what's the error rates, and so forth. So that's all laid out in our EVES report that can be found on eac.gov.
In addition to
EAC.gov. No, I don't know. I don't have an exact. It's basically 2 or 3 million data points put in there, and I would be amazing if I could remember all those things. But that's why we're saying it's on EAC.gov. But the secretaries might be able to comment a little bit more on what's in particular in their states.
we've done recounts. I've done recounts. My clerks have done recounts. I have never seen a single result changed as a result of a recount. So in terms of the error rate, it's essentially zero. I've had this discussion with, equipment manufacturers who made SAT exams, for example, or scoring, and their error rate is not zero, whereas the error rate we demand from our manufacturers under EAC standards, under our state standards, is zero.
And I totally agree with that, and I would just say that another mechanism that we didn't talk about today, which is really important in the circumstances you talked about, is automatic recount requirements in particularly close races, which we do in New Mexico and have done since 2006. So in addition to post-election audits, when we also have extremely narrow state races, we automatically do recounts, and that addresses even the fear of that issue.
And then the second part of your question dealt with registration and mobility, and we are a very mobile country. That's a significant issue, and online voter registration is great for new registrants, but it's also great for keeping these up to date. You have thoughts on that?
Well, in the automatic process, most people get a driver's license fairly shortly after moving, or a state-issued ID, so that's an automatic process we use in Colorado. We even allow folks to come in on election day and register to vote. It's better if you do it ahead of time, because it's a little slower if you got to fill out the stuff. But it's an easy process for everybody, and so no one gets excluded in Colorado for that reason.
Okay.
Also,
Can't speak for every state.
Also, just quickly, one of the major innovations in the last 6 years or so has been ERIC, which is a program that states participate in where they share registration data both within the state but across state lines to try to help do that outreach to voters that have moved, update their registration, and ensure their franchise. So ERIC has been really important. I know both your states are engaged in that.
We mailed out 55,000 postcards to eligible but unregistered voters in late August of this year through the ERIC program, and in September of this year, we had 29,000 new or updated voter registrations through our online portal in New Mexico, and we haven't tracked the exact number that came through ERIC, but using tools like that, which 22 states and the District of Columbia do, is also extremely useful.
Great. I think we have time for one last question. We'll do it right here.
Derek Hawkins from the Washington Post. We're hearing about all this really important work that each of you guys is doing, each of your offices is doing to improve election security across the country. Congress, aside from making a sort of down payment to upgrade quite a bit of election infrastructure right as primary season was getting underway, hasn't passed any election security legislation in the 2 years, the same 2 years that you guys have been working on this, and they're just as aware of the problems as y'all are. How big of an issue is that for you, and what do you want to see lawmakers do that they haven't done already?
Well, similar to something that Secretary Williams mentioned earlier, he had made a significant change in terms of implementing automatic voter registration in Colorado, and then what he did when he came in is convince the legislature to codify that. I would say that secretaries of state have very differing point of views on this matter, but speaking for myself personally, I feel the same way. I think this great relationship that we've developed, the sharing of information, the establishment of the Government Coordinating Council, the notion that we might have some additional funding coming down the pike on a regular basis, these are all things that I would like to see. I would personally like to see all of them codified, but there's some natural skepticism among secretaries about the federal government's role in managing elections at the state level, and so I think there's always that balance that needs to be struck, but I personally would like to see what we're doing now kind of set in stone, or with flexibility, of course, but so that we don't undo this really good, important work in the future.
So from my perspective, that first, the additional funds that was provided, and as I reference again, because I do think it's appropriate to give credit when it happens, which is unusual at the federal level, those funds were actually allocated to the states incredibly quickly, so that we could actually use them. I think that's important. I think what Homeland Security is doing now is important. The challenge is, will that always be there? Certainly in terms of buying our own equipment, of doing things locally, those are state and local issues. But we can't fight, as the state of Colorado, Russia or China or a nation state. And so we do need that on an ongoing basis. The National Association of Secretaries of State is in the process right now of adopting legislative standards for what we believe needs to happen going forward. I'm on the executive committee. I got my vote in today. Leslie told, and she voted yesterday, so you got two of the members of the executive committee here. I think ongoing, particularly on the cybersecurity area where we're dealing with nation-state threats, codifying that there is support from the federal government, so we're not relying upon having a Homeland Security Secretary that pays attention to us, not reliant on them hiring Matt Masterson, because Matt may not always live, or may sometimes win the lottery.
Do you know something I don't?
All things are finite. But I think those are some of the things that at the state level we're concerned about going forward, and why we think, most of us think there ought to be something going forward that on those levels provides ongoing federal support. And I should note that all of the support Homeland Security is giving us isn't in that, none of that support is in that allocation of HAVA money. That's all in addition to that the federal government has been providing. We want that to continue, and frankly, we need it to continue.
Well, the audience here, the viewers, I think they'll know a lot more about how we're running our elections. I'd like to thank Secretaries Toulouse, Oliver, and Williams, EAC Chairman Hicks, and DHS's Matt Masterson. Thank you for your knowledge.
Thank you. Appreciate it.